The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn silence of forward operating base Viper like a scream. Major Rebecca Ghost Thorne was 300 miles away, wrestling her damaged C-130J through a sandstorm that turned the sky into an angry yellow hell when the transmission came through. Any station, this is Outpost 77. We have multiple KIA critical wounded, need immediate medical evacuation. Weather closing fast. This is not a drill. Ghost's knuckles whitened on the yoke as she fought to keep the Hercules level. The left engine was running rough, throwing metal shavings into the oil system, and her co-pilot was unconscious, blood seeping through the bandage wrapped around his head from the shrapnel that had found its way through their supposedly armored cockpit. She should have been heading back to base, following protocol, getting her wounded crew member to safety. Instead, she banked hard toward the coordinates crackling through her headset. "Ghost, this is command," came the voice of General Morrison, crisp and dismissive even through the interference. "Return to base immediately. Outpost 77 is a no-fly zone. Winds are gusting to 70 knots, visibility 0. Only pilots with 1,000 hours on that particular approach have any business attempting a landing there." Rebecca keyed her mic, her voice steady despite the aircraft bucking beneath her like an angry horse. "Copy, command. Ghost has 962 hours logged." She paused, watching the altimeter spin as another gust dropped them 200 feet in an instant. Close enough. The silence that followed spoke volumes. In the background of the radio transmission, she could hear the barely contained scoffs of the other pilots monitoring the frequency. Martinez from the 43rd probably rolling his eyes. Henderson muttering something about rookie moves under his breath. They'd been waiting for her to wash out since the day she'd arrived at Viper, the first female pilot to fly heavy transport in this particular corner of hell. What they didn't know, what the general's neat little personnel files couldn't capture, was that Rebecca Thorne had been landing aircraft in places they shouldn't land since she was 17, flying crop dusters through Nebraska thunderstorms that would make these desert winds look like a gentle breeze. She'd earned her wings not in the sanitized environment of flight school, but in the back country of Montana, where her grandfather had taught her that sometimes the right thing to do and the safe thing to do were two entirely different choices. Below, 37 Marines were bleeding out in a valley that maps said didn't exist. Above, the storm was about to make its final, killing blow. The radio chatter had gone quiet now, as if the entire theater of operations was holding its breath. Ghost adjusted her heading, feeling the weight of every decision that had led her to this moment. The aircraft groaned around her, metal fatigue singing its own death song, but she pressed forward through the wall of sand and wind that seemed determined to swat her from the sky like an annoying insect. Her co-pilot, Lieutenant Danny "Wreck" Morrison, no relation to the general, just one of those cosmic jokes the military specialized in, stirred in his seat, blood-crusted eyes flickering open. "Where? Where are we?" he mumbled, his words slurred by the concussion that had been rattling around his skull since the mortar round had found their altitude 20 minutes ago. "About to do something stupid," Ghost replied, her eyes never leaving the instruments that were telling her at least 6 different ways she was about to die. The GPS was spinning like a confused compass. The artificial horizon was more artificial than real, and the radio altimeter was giving her readings that suggested she was either flying upside down or the ground was directly above her head. Through the swirling sand, she caught a glimpse of the mountain ridge that marked the approach to Outpost 77. It rose from the desert floor like the spine of some prehistoric beast, its peaks lost in the storm clouds that seemed to have settled permanently over this particular piece of Afghanistan. The approach was a narrow canyon barely wider than her wingspan, with walls that rose on both sides like the jaws of a trap waiting to snap shut. Ghost, this is 77 Actual," came a new voice, younger, desperate, tinged with the kind of fear that came from watching good men die while you could do nothing but apply pressure to wounds that were too big for band-aids. "We've got a Marine down here, took shrapnel to the femoral artery. He's not going to make it another hour. Please, ma'am, if there's any way." The transmission cut off, lost in a burst of static that sounded like the world ending. Ghost looked at her fuel gauge. She had maybe 40 minutes of flight time left, enough to get back to base with a comfortable margin for error. The smart play was obvious. Turn around, let someone else handle this mess, file a report that would absolve her of any responsibility for what happened to the Marines trapped in that valley. She'd done her job, delivered her cargo, taken enemy fire, and brought her aircraft back in one piece, minus the co-pilot's consciousness and a few non-essential systems. But Rebecca Thorne had never been particularly good at making the smart play. She pushed the throttles forward, feeling the engines respond with a surge of power that made the entire airframe shudder. The C-130 wasn't built for aerobatics, wasn't designed to thread through mountain passes in zero visibility, but it had been built by people who understood that sometimes you had to ask an aircraft to do things that weren't in the manual. "Wreck," she said, not looking at her co-pilot but knowing he was conscious enough to hear her. "I need you to call out my altitude when we start the approach. Can you do that?" He nodded weakly, fumbling for his headset with hands that shook from more than just the turbulence. "Roger that, Ghost. How low are we going?" She allowed herself a grim smile as the canyon walls rose up on either side of them, close enough that she could see the individual rocks that would turn them into a crater if she misjudged her clearance by even a few feet. Low enough to make the angels nervous. The storm seemed to sense their intention, redoubling its efforts to drive them from the sky. Wind shear caught them like a giant hand, slamming them sideways toward the canyon wall with enough force to snap the necks of anyone not properly strapped in. Ghost fought the controls, her arms burning with the effort of keeping them centered in the narrow corridor of survivable space between the rock faces. "Altitude 4,000 feet, Rek called out, his voice stronger now, the adrenaline beginning to burn through the fog of his concussion. 3,800, 3,006. The ground was rushing up to meet them now, visible in brief glimpses through the swirling sand. Ghost could see the landing strip, if you could call a stretch of relatively flat dirt a landing strip, carved into the valley floor like a scar. It was shorter than anything she'd ever attempted in a C-130, surrounded by obstacles that would turn any mistake into a funeral, but it was there, and that was enough. 3,000 feet, Rek announced. Ghost were coming in pretty hot. She nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. The aircraft was fighting her every input now, the damaged engine throwing vibrations through the airframe that made it feel like they were trying to land inside a paint mixer. Her hands moved across the controls with the fluid precision of someone who had been born to fly, making minute adjustments that kept them on the razor's edge between controlled flight and catastrophic impact. Below them, she could see muzzle flashes winking like deadly fireflies in the darkness. The Marines at Outpost 77 were still taking fire, still fighting, still dying while she wrestled her aircraft through the storm. The thought of those men, bleeding and afraid in a place the rest of the world had forgotten, gave her the strength to push the C-130 beyond its limits one more time. The wind grabbed them again, this time from below, lifting them up like a leaf in a hurricane. For a moment, they were climbing instead of descending, the landing strip falling away beneath them as the storm tried to dash them against the canyon walls. Ghost compensated, pushing the nose down more aggressively than any flight manual would recommend, feeling the aircraft's protests in every rivet and weld. 2,000 feet, Rek called out, 1,800. The radio erupted with chatter as word of their approach spread through the chain of command. She could hear General Morrison's voice, sharp with authority and barely contained anger. "Ghost, abort your approach immediately. That's a direct order. Return to base." She reached over and switched off the radio. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the howl of wind over aluminum and the labored breathing of her co-pilot. In that moment, suspended between earth and sky, between duty and conscience, Rebecca Thorne made peace with whatever was about to happen. She thought of her grandfather, who had taught her that flying was just controlled falling, and that the secret was knowing when to let go of the controls and trust the aircraft to find its own way home. 1,000 feet, Rec announced, his voice barely audible over the storm. 800, 600. The landing strip rushed up to meet them, no longer a distant target but an immediate and unforgiving reality. Ghost could see the Marines now, tiny figures running for cover as her aircraft thundered out of the storm like some mechanical angel of mercy. She pulled the throttles back, feeling the engines wind down, and prepared to greet the earth with all the grace she could muster. The first impact came sooner than expected, the main landing gear kissing the dirt with a violence that sent shockwaves through the entire aircraft. They bounced, airborne again for a terrifying moment, before slamming back down with enough force to rattle every tooth in their heads. The brakes screamed against the wheels, fighting to bring 40 tons of aircraft and cargo to a stop in a space designed for vehicles 1/10 their size. Dust and debris exploded around them as they slid toward the end of the makeshift runway, the C-130's massive bulk throwing up a cloud that turned day into night. Ghost stood on the brakes, feeling the pedals sink toward the floor as the hydraulic system fought to maintain pressure. Through the windscreen, she could see the end of the runway approaching with mathematical certainty, a wall of rock and sand that would stop them permanently if they didn't find a way to stop themselves first. "Come on," she whispered, her voice lost in the chaos of screaming metal and howling wind. "Come on, baby, talk to me." The aircraft shuddered, lurched, and finally came to rest with its nose wheel hanging over a ravine that dropped away into darkness. For a moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody dared to believe that they had actually survived what should have been impossible. Then Rec keyed his microphone, his voice shaky but triumphant. 7-7 actual, this is Ghost. We're on the ground. Where do you want your wounded? The response came immediately, crackling with relief and disbelief in equal measure. Ghost, this is 7-7 actual. Holy shit, ma'am. I don't know how you did that, but we've got stretchers inbound to your position. Stand by for medical personnel. Ghost allowed herself a moment to breathe, feeling the adrenaline begin to ebb from her system like a receding tide. Through the side window, she could see Marines running toward their aircraft, their faces lit with the kind of hope that came from seeing the impossible made real. Among them, she spotted a figure being carried on a stretcher, the Marine who had taken shrapnel to the femoral artery, still alive, still fighting. That was when she knew it had been worth it. The cargo bay door opened with a hydraulic whine, and suddenly the aircraft was filled with controlled chaos as medical personnel swarmed aboard. Ghost remained in her seat, running through the shutdown checklist with mechanical precision, while her mind processed what had just happened. She had landed a C-130 in conditions that should have been unsurvivable, in a location that wasn't supposed to exist, because 37 Marines needed her to do the impossible. "Ma'am," one of the Marines, a young corporal with dirt-caked cheeks and eyes that had seen too much, appeared at her shoulder. "The guys wanted me to tell you. Well, they wanted me to tell you thanks. What you did flying through that storm, nobody else would have even tried." Ghost turned to look at him, this boy soldier who couldn't have been more than 20, and saw herself reflected in his gratitude. "That's what we're here for, Marine, to bring you home." He nodded, understanding passing between them that needed no words. As he turned to go, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "Ma'am, what they're saying on the radio about you only having 900 hours, is that true?" She smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed in weeks. 962 actually, but who's counting? The corporal grinned back, shaking his head in amazement. "Damn, ma'am. 962 hours, and you just made the impossible look easy." As he disappeared back into the cargo bay, Ghost turned her attention to the radio, which she had switched back on to coordinate the medical evacuation. The airwaves were buzzing with chatter, most of it centered around her unauthorized landing and the disciplinary action that was certainly coming her way. General Morrison's voice cut through the noise like a blade, cold and precise. "Ghost, when you return to base, report directly to my office for debriefing. We have a lot to discuss." She keyed her microphone, her voice steady and professional. "Copy that command. Ghost will report as ordered." But there was something else in the radio chatter now, something that hadn't been there before. The other pilots, Martinez, Henderson, the whole squadron, their voices carried a different tone. Respect, maybe, or at least the grudging acknowledgement that she had done something they wouldn't have attempted. "Ghost, this is Hammer 2-1, came Martinez's voice, unusually subdued. "Hell of a landing, ma'am, hell of a landing." Similar transmissions followed, brief and professional, but carrying an undercurrent of recognition that marked a shift in the squadron's perception of their newest member. She was no longer the rookie who needed to prove herself, no longer the outsider who didn't belong. She was the pilot who had flown through hell to save 37 Marines, and that was a currency that bought respect in any language. Rex stirred in his seat, his concussion beginning to clear as the medical personnel worked to stabilize him for transport. "Ghost," he said, his voice hoarse but clear, "you realize you just ended your career, right? The general isn't going to let this slide." She considered this, watching through the windscreen as the last of the wounded Marines was loaded aboard their aircraft. The storm was beginning to break, shafts of sunlight piercing through the clouds to illuminate the valley in golden light. It looked almost peaceful now, this place that had been a battleground just minutes before. "Maybe," she said finally, "but sometimes you have to choose between your career and your conscience. I'm good with the choice I made." The return flight to forward operating base Viper was uneventful, the storm having spent its fury and moved on to torment some other corner of the world. Ghost flew with the mechanical precision that came from years of training, her mind already preparing for the confrontation that awaited her on the ground. She had violated direct orders, endangered her aircraft and crew, and attempted a landing that was beyond her certified qualifications. By any military standard, she had committed acts worthy of court-martial. But she had also saved 37 lives. The mathematics of that equation seemed clear to her, even if it wouldn't be clear to the review board that would undoubtedly be convened to examine her actions. Military justice was a precise instrument, designed to maintain order and discipline through the consistent application of rules and regulations. It didn't leave much room for the kind of moral calculations that had driven her to ignore General Morrison's direct order. As they approached Viper, Ghost could see the crowd that had gathered on the tarmac. Word of her unauthorized mission had spread through the base like wildfire, and it seemed like half the personnel stationed there had found reasons to be outside when she landed. Some of them were probably there to witness her professional execution, but others, the medics who would be receiving the wounded, the ground crews who understood what it meant to push equipment beyond its limits, they were there for different reasons. The landing was textbook perfect, a stark contrast to the barely controlled crash she had managed at Outpost 77. The C-130 touched down gently, rolled to a stop with mechanical precision, and shut down without ceremony. As the engines wound down and the propellers stopped turning, Ghost found herself staring at the base operations building where General Morrison would be waiting. "Whatever happens," Rex said, unbuckling his harness with hands that no longer shook, "it was worth it. What we did out there, saving those Marines. It was worth whatever comes next." Ghost nodded, appreciating the solidarity but knowing that ultimately she would face the consequences alone. Command responsibility was a lonely burden, especially when that command involved making decisions that couldn't be justified by regulation or procedure. She had acted on instinct and conscience, and now she would have to explain those actions to men who thought in terms of risk assessment and mission parameters. The cargo bay door opened, and the controlled chaos of a medical evacuation began again. Stretchers were loaded into waiting ambulances, wounded Marines were transferred to the base hospital, and the machinery of military medicine went to work saving lives that had been snatched from the edge of eternity. Ghost watched it all from her pilot's seat, feeling a quiet satisfaction that no disciplinary action could diminish. "Ma'am," the same young corporal from Outpost 77 appeared at her shoulder again, this time in a clean uniform with his face washed and his eyes bright with something that might have been hero worship. "The Marine you saved, the one with the arterial bleeding. Doc says he's going to make it. Thought you'd want to know." She felt something tight in her chest loosen, a tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. "What's his name?" "Private First Class Tommy Rodriguez, ma'am. Kid from El Paso, just turned 19 last month. He's got a wife and a baby on the way." The corporal paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "Ma'am, what you did? That baby's going to have a father because of you. I just thought you should know that." Ghost nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. This was why she flew, why she had chosen a career that involved strapping herself into machines that defied gravity and common sense. Not for the thrill or the challenge, but for moments like this, when the mathematics of flight intersected with the algebra of human need and produced something that looked like a miracle. "Thank you, Corporal," she managed. "That means more than you know." As he left, Ghost began the post-flight checklist, her hands moving through the familiar routine while her mind prepared for what was coming. She had approximately 10 minutes before she would have to report to General Morrison's office, 10 minutes to compose herself and organize her thoughts into something resembling a coherent explanation for her actions. The truth was, she wasn't sure she could explain it, at least not in terms that would satisfy a military tribunal. She had acted on instinct, driven by a combination of training, conscience, and the kind of stubborn determination that had gotten her into trouble since childhood. How do you quantify the weight of 37 lives? How do you measure the value of doing the right thing against the cost of disobeying a direct order? "Ghost." The voice belonged to Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Pierce, the squadron commander, a woman whose own career had been built on walking the tightrope between military discipline and operational necessity. She appeared at the aircraft door like a messenger from the professional gods, her expression unreadable. "The general wants to see you. Now." Ghost nodded, gathering her flight gear and her courage in equal measure. As she followed Pierce across the tarmac, she noticed the way other personnel watched her passage. Some with curiosity, some with judgment, but many with something that looked suspiciously like respect. Word of her storm landing had spread beyond the base, carried by the radio chatter that connected every outpost and forward position in the theater. She was becoming something she had never intended to be, a legend in the making. General Morrison's office was exactly what she had expected: austere, functional, dominated by maps and operational charts that showed the disposition of forces across 1,000 miles of hostile territory. The general himself was behind his desk, a man in his 50s with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too many young officers make too many stupid decisions. He didn't look up when she entered, didn't acknowledge her presence until she had assumed the position of attention and announced herself. "Major Thorne, reporting as ordered, sir." Finally, he looked up, studying her with the intensity of a scientist examining a particularly interesting specimen. "Sit down, Major. We have a lot to discuss." She took the offered chair, maintaining perfect military posture while her mind raced through the possible outcomes of this conversation. Court-martial was obviously on the table, but there were other possibilities: administrative action, reassignment, or the kind of career-ending letter of reprimand that would follow her for the rest of her military service. 962 hours, the general said, consulting a file that presumably contained her complete aviation record. "That's what you told me over the radio. 962 hours of flight time, and you thought that qualified you to attempt a landing that I specifically told you was beyond your capabilities." "Yes, sir." "And yet, here you are, having successfully completed that landing and evacuated 37 wounded Marines from a position that 3 other pilots declined to approach. His voice remained neutral, giving no indication of his thoughts on the matter. Would you care to explain how that's possible? Ghost considered her answer carefully, knowing that her next words would likely determine the trajectory of her career. Sir, I believed that the mission requirements justified the risk. The Marines at Outpost 77 needed immediate medical evacuation, and I was the only aircraft in position to provide it. Even though you lacked the experience I deemed necessary for such an approach. Sir, experience is measured in more than just flight hours. I've been landing aircraft in challenging conditions since I was 17. The specific approach to 7-7 was new to me, but the principles of flying in adverse weather and confined spaces were not. The general leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he considered her response. Major, you violated a direct order. You endangered your aircraft, your crew, and potentially compromised operational security by attempting a mission beyond your certified capabilities. In any other circumstances, I would be convening a court-martial board to determine the appropriate punishment for your actions. Ghost felt her heart sink, but she maintained her composure. I understand, sir. However, the general continued, and that single word carried the weight of salvation. The results speak for themselves. 37 Marines are alive today because of your decision to ignore my order. Private Rodriguez, in particular, owes his life to your willingness to attempt the impossible. He stood, moving to a wall map that showed the disposition of forces across the theater. Major, in 30 years of military service, I've learned that there are times when the book provides all the answers you need, and times when you have to throw the book away and rely on judgment, instinct, and pure balls. Today was one of the latter. Ghost felt a surge of hope, but she remained cautious. Military discipline was not easily set aside, even for successful outcomes. That said, the general continued, turning back to face her, you placed me in an impossible position. I gave you a direct order based on sound operational judgment, and you chose to ignore it. If I let that slide without consequences, I undermine the entire chain of command. Every pilot in this squadron will think they can pick and choose which orders to follow based on their personal assessment of the situation. I understand, sir. I accept full responsibility for my actions. The general nodded approvingly. Good, because here's what's going to happen. Officially, you will receive a letter of reprimand for violating direct orders and attempting a landing beyond your certified capabilities. That letter will go in your permanent record, and it will impact your future promotions and assignments. Ghost felt the weight of professional disappointment, but she had expected as much. Yes, sir. Unofficially, the general continued, his voice taking on a different tone, you will be redesignated as a qualified pilot for high-risk extractions. Your actions today demonstrated a level of skill and judgment that can't be taught in flight school. We need pilots who can make the hard calls when the situation demands it. The implications of this statement took a moment to sink in. A designation as a high-risk extraction specialist was both a punishment and a reward. It meant more dangerous missions, but also recognition as one of the squadron's elite pilots. Furthermore, the general said, returning to his desk, you now have over 1,000 hours logged on challenging approaches. Congratulations, Major. You've earned the hard way what others get through routine repetition. Ghost allowed herself a small smile. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. Your next assignment is going to make today's mission look like a training exercise. We have assets trapped in places that don't appear on any map, Marines fighting in valleys that officially don't exist, and extraction requirements that would make a helicopter pilot weep. You've just volunteered to be our go-to pilot for the missions nobody else wants. As she left the general's office, Ghost felt a complex mixture of emotions. Her career had been fundamentally altered by the events of the day, marked by both official censure and unofficial recognition. She was now part of an elite group of pilots who specialized in the impossible, the kind of missions that would never appear in official reports, but would save lives that mattered more than career advancement. The sun was setting over Forward Operating Base Viper, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that reminded her of the Nebraska sunsets of her childhood. Somewhere in the base hospital, private first class, Tommy Rodriguez was recovering from his wounds, alive because she had chosen conscience over career. 36 other Marines were receiving treatment, writing letters home, or simply breathing because she had decided that 962 hours was close enough to 1,000. As the stars began to appear in the desert sky, Ghost realized that she had found her place in the military universe. Not as the rookie who needed to prove herself, not as the outsider fighting for acceptance, but as the pilot who would fly when others couldn't, land where others wouldn't, and bring home the warriors who defended the thin line between civilization and chaos. The radio in the operations building crackled to life, carrying reports from across the theater of operations. Somewhere out there, in places that existed only in classified briefings and the nightmares of infantry commanders, more Marines were fighting, bleeding, and dying for causes that history might never fully understand. And when they needed extraction from positions that couldn't be reached by conventional means, when they were trapped in places where the weather was too bad and the approaches too dangerous for normal operations, they would call for Ghost. She had earned her call sign the hard way, by becoming the pilot who appeared out of storms and vanished into legend, leaving behind only the lives she had saved and the impossible made routine. In the years that would follow, that call sign would become synonymous with hope for Marines trapped in hopeless situations, a promise that no matter how bad things got, no matter how impossible the extraction seemed, there was always one pilot willing to try. But that night, as she walked across the tarmac toward her quarters, Ghost was simply Major Rebecca Thorne, a pilot who had learned that sometimes the difference between right and wrong was measured not in flight hours or military regulations, but in the weight of 37 lives and the courage to choose conscience over career. The sky above her was vast and star-filled, full of infinite possibilities for those brave enough to claim them, and she knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to do the impossible, and new chances to prove that sometimes the most important missions were the ones that couldn't be found in any manual. In the distance, she could hear the sound of helicopters lifting off for night operations, their rotors beating against the desert air like mechanical hearts. Soon, she would join them in the darkness, carrying hope to places where hope was in short supply, landing in storms that would make other pilots turn back, and proving again and again that the only limitations that really mattered were the ones you accepted for yourself. The legend of Ghost had been born in a storm over a valley that didn't exist, but it would grow in the quiet moments between missions, in the gratitude of Marines who came home when they shouldn't have, and in the knowledge that sometimes the right thing to do was also the hardest thing to do. And Rebecca Thorne, the crop duster's granddaughter who had learned to fly in Nebraska thunderstorms, had finally found her place in a war that would never end, as the pilot who brought warriors home from the edge of forever. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human conflict but somehow approving of human courage, and Ghost walked on toward whatever impossible mission waited in tomorrow's dawn, ready to prove once again that sometimes 962 hours was exactly enough to save the world, one Marine at a time.